All right, welcome into a special edition of Who's Got Next, your Michigan football recruiting show here on Maize and Blue Review, brought to you by Rivals. With me is Ari Wasserman from The Athletic. Ari, you're terrible at fantasy football, but you are pretty incredible at breaking down recruiting and seeing the intricacies that maybe others don't see. So wanted to bring you on today, and I think a lot of people are automatically going to see that name and think this guy really hates Michigan. But I don't think you do. We've discussed it. You've got the stadium in your office. We've had conversations away from here. I know you simply have thoughts and analysis the same way you do with everything else. So we're going to dive into that today. Play a little, I don't know, we'll call it devil's advocate, but we're just going to look at all angles of Michigan recruiting. And why we want to do that is because it's been such a polarizing topic over the past year. It's really been a polarizing topic since Harbaugh got here, but for different reasons now than the sleepovers from a few years back. So, Ari, how you doing? What's the recruiting landscape been like for you navigating over the past few months? I know it's been a far different landscape than ones in years past. So just talk a little bit about what maybe NIL has done and how different you see recruiting now compared to a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the way I view recruiting has just been in constant shift. So anybody who doesn't know my background, and, for those of you who hate me who are listening to this, I covered Ohio State for a very long time. And during that time, I got a very up close and personal view of what recruiting looks like at the highest level. And when I went national at the Athletic and left the Ohio State beat and left the state of Ohio, I got to look at it from a national scope, and it kind of changed the way I view it again, and then COVID happened, and that was all weird. And then I had a child last year, and then now this year we have more evolution in the sport in the past 2 years than the previous 50 combined. You've got the introduction of NIL. You've got transfer rules that are kind of shaking things up a little bit. There's certain rules within recruiting that are shifting, personal workouts and things like that when kids can come on campus. And, I guess the best way to answer that question is that I feel like it's just kind of changing so much that it is hard to really predict what it will look like in 3 or 4 or 5 years. The hardest thing that I have to struggle with, as it pertains to recruiting analysis is that 3 or 4 years ago, results of recruiting classes and flips and decommitments and commitments, all you could hold the coach liable. It's right there. The results are there for you, and now in a world where there are, inducements and financial implications for players to go certain places, it's hard to hold the coach accountable or to laud the coach for doing a good job because you don't necessarily know the reasons why. And I'm not naive enough to think that cheating didn't exist before and all the bagmen and all the stuff that goes on that people complain about. But now that it is a legal process, maybe it's illegal to induce, but it's legal to pay people for their name, image, and likeness. The reasons why these coaches are getting recruiting wins might not be in their hands anymore, which kind of takes away the analysis of it, the analysis piece. So, I'm trying my best to keep my head above water. I'm trying to analyze recruiting in a way that is fair still, while also understanding that, a coach might lose a kid for reasons that have nothing to do with how hard he tried or how good of a recruiter he is. And of course, I still think that what those 247 Sports composite rankings look like at the end of the year, Rivals obviously included into that mix, what the rankings look like at all the sites will have a huge impact on who's good enough to win a national title at the end of the road and which teams are going to be good and which ones aren't.
Yeah, and you talk about just how things have been so volatile in recruiting. There's been so many things that have changed over the past 5 years plus. It started smaller, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago when there started to be just social media and the integration of that along with recruiting and how that changed. And you think about the smaller things like recruiting videos. Like we used to think that commitment videos were like a new development in recruiting. If you would have told us how crazy it was going to get in today's world and how much it was going to change, thinking back then, you would have thought it was crazy. But we're here now. We're in this landscape. It's present day in recruiting. It's what we have to deal with. So Michigan
and Brandon too, not to interrupt you there, but my background, I started at Rivals, and that. I feel for people at Rivals and at 247 and, On3 and all these places because Twitter has become the recruiting database because everything is out in the open now. Like the back in the day when I first started, top fives were premium information and visits and all these things. And now it's just out there. Like, I don't know that you could exist in the recruiting landscape without Twitter. So like it is evolving for the way we cover it too, and the way that you put together stories that are interesting for people to want to pay for. You guys have done a pretty good job of doing that. So congratulations on that. It's just the whole thing has shifted in the last 10 years so dramatically that like recruiting videos is like the least of our concerns,
Yeah, and that's what's crazy is it's just become what it's become, and it's just we're here and we're doing it, but sometimes you take a seat and you look back on how it was as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, and you're kind of like, whoa, how did we even get here?
That
And
Spider-Man picture of him like touching or was that Wolverine touching
oh yeah,
the
yeah,
picture in bed? It's like, oh, what would I do for it to be 5 years ago when times were simpler? No, it's I just think that my buddy always says this to me, but adapt or die, and it's kind of one of these things of just like, you might not like the direction it's headed or, how hard it is to keep up or, and I know that Michigan fans in general have a really big predisposition to hating NIL because of the position that the university and its boosters have seemingly taken on it on a surface, at least in the infancy of it. But that's the way it works now. So you have to get on the bus and try to figure out a way to navigate it.
So you bring up Michigan and how they were in the infancy of this whole thing with NIL and how it was kind of, I mean, we'll just not even kind of, it was a full on slow burn for Michigan with NIL and
Mm-hmm.
how they were going to navigate it. And, something that I tried to preach was from what we heard, it was really just trying to cross their T's and dot their I's and make sure that this wasn't going to be something that helped them now and hurt them later and vice versa. So with recent developments, Michigan launched the Ann Arbor NIL Club, which is a bit of a tongue twister. And what that's done for them is it's created a platform that's team centric, and
Mm-hmm.
every player is able to, take rewards from that. And all they have to do is serve these members, quote unquote, of the club. And what the members get is they get access to a message board where the players are on the message board. They get to hang out with the players for special events here and there. There's a steak dinner if you donate enough, and you donate monthly, and it all goes back to the players. And they've drawn in, well, Michigan's the #1 public university in the country, right? They've drawn in a ton of people and a ton of fans who have no problem putting forth $100 plus per month to support the team, support the players. So before we dive into the nitty gritty of Michigan's recruiting, talk a bit about their NIL developments, including that one, which I think maybe solves a little bit, but there's still some things from a Michigan perspective that's happening elsewhere, but not happening here. So talk a little bit
Mm-hmm.
about the approach they've taken and how it might differentiate from the others.
Well, my take on NIL in general has always been that there's going to be teams that adapt very quickly. Tennessee, there's certain teams that have been on the aggressive side of things, and there are certain teams like Michigan who have just now created this collective that you just mentioned in the last few weeks. And my idea of this whole thing is that what you just described is what everybody has, and I think that in 2 or 3 years, everybody's going to have that. And then hopefully it will get back to feeling like more of a level playing field. Because there aren't going to be places that you go to that don't have some sort of fund or some sort of fan booster generated fund that's going to funnel money back to the players, because that's the easiest, simplest way to get these guys paid. And rightfully so. So good on Michigan for having it. You know what I mean? But not innovative at all, because everybody has that. Vanderbilt made one 3 months ago, so the thing that I think is interesting about Michigan, and I don't know if this is a specific thing about NIL, but there does seem to be this thing about that university, and rightfully so, maybe because it's such a great academic institution, is that they are not ever going to do things that put them in the football factory category. Is that fair to say? That they don't want to be a football factory. They want to be a Michigan men generated, education first, football isn't the only thing that matters in Ann Arbor type of program. Now, stop me there if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the traditions and the foundations of the university are certainly put at the forefront. The only development that's really occurred there is that they brought in a new president, And Santana was fantastic when he was in Cincinnati, and he just spent the past 4 years at British Columbia. And he is supposedly going to be a extremely big factor in pushing forwards towards those types of things with athletics. He's very athletic friendly, whereas their previous president, Mark Schlissel, was like vehemently against athletics. Like he was. It's not a secret that pretty much every athletic coach within Michigan's programs disliked him. I mean, he didn't come to games, he didn't support them, he was against anything that might have pushed the agenda, and so that's the only new development there. But you're right about the foundational beliefs, and I don't think that's going to change enough to put them in that football factory category where they want to prioritize it over academics. I don't see that ever happening at Michigan, no matter who the president is. But
yeah, and I don't know if positive development over academics is even the right way to put it, because I do think that you can still, promote academic excellence while also going all in on your football program. But the thing that's always been a curious, dynamic for me in Michigan is that they sleep, eat, and breathe the desire to beat Ohio State, but then they don't put into the program what it takes to be them, and that's really hard. And what they did last year was amazing. They kicked the crap out of them. I mean, they literally beat the crap out of them and won the Big Ten, and they got to the place that people thought or were beginning to think was impossible. So kudos to them for doing it. But in order to beat Ohio State on the grand scheme, which is, winning 5 out of 10 or winning the Big Ten and making the playoff more than once every 10 years, you have to invest into the athletics side of things the same way that your competition does. And that's not just an Ohio State discussion. That's an Alabama discussion, a Georgia discussion, a Texas discussion. If you want to be in the playoff and you want to win national titles, you can't do it by putting your nose up at the idea that you have to go all in on football. So the thing that I thought was interesting was when Marcus Freeman got hired at Notre Dame, he made a comment that I thought was pretty astute. And I kind of think about it quite a bit. And he said, just because we're an academic institution with the traditions of excellence in the classroom doesn't mean that we can't be completely and utterly obsessive with our football program. And the first thing I thought was, that's exactly what Michigan's coach has to say. That's exactly what Michigan has to do as a university. And, we'll still see exactly how good Notre Dame is in 5 years and whether or not that's the answer. But I do think that there needs to be a shift in just the viewpoint of the way that the university operates. You can still go to Michigan, you can still be a Michigan man, and you can still get a great education and excel outside of the classroom. I think that's great. When my child goes to college, I hope she is in that category. But in order to be the best, you have to invest financially and, just thought process wise, the same way your competition does. And, maybe that's something that people listening to this podcast are tearing their hair out over hearing, or maybe they agree with me, but I do think that there is a difference between the way that Ohio State emphasizes the football I mean, you would think it's a 364-day funeral in Columbus right now, and that's just the way it is there. So, that to me has always been the biggest difference between the two.
And I think you're right. And I think a lot of people would agree with you that are listening to this show and the fact that Michigan should do exactly what you're advising them to do. And I think to a degree, Michigan thinks it's done that. Like there are people and individuals, on the board, regents there on top of people who are in the athletic offices and even in the football offices who fully believe that they've done that they've prioritized football to that point, and that they've invested to that point and all. They are completely convinced they've done it internally. How or what needs to be done to get to the point where they've invested like Ohio State without sacrificing?
It's an obsession. I think it's a mindset.
Yeah. And I agree with you because Michigan and what I think kind of makes them different than Ohio State is, well, first and foremost, everyone that likes to point towards Michigan being this like unequivocal institution in comparison to Ohio State, like, yes, Michigan's clearly a better university, but it's not like Ohio State is some slouch. It's not like you're going to, Jackawanna State University or anything. It's not. This is a legitimate.
It's hard to get into there.
And that's what I'm saying. And we as, bless our board, but the easiest jab is how much better of a school Michigan is Ohio State. And the 1%, sure. like in the 1%, absolutely. But from a macro perspective, from a football perspective, how many athletes are going to Michigan over Ohio State purely based on academics? I don't think that's going to happen.
And the question that I have too, back to you, Brandon, is how many of the top 5 players or the 5-star players in Ohio State's classes the last 7 years would not have been takes for Michigan? If you actually look at it that way, it's like, okay, those dumbasses down in Columbus, going and getting all these football players that don't emphasize that, academics. It's like, well, if you actually go look at the recruits, a lot of them had Michigan offers, and a lot of them Michigan would have taken in the snap of a finger. So, if you want, my thing with Michigan has always been I don't think anybody's debating what's a better academic institution.
Right.
But nobody's on the message boards complaining and arguing and yelling about academics. It's like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about football. So, it's like, if you want to, look at the Princeton Review or whatever that thing is that ranks colleges, sure, then, but then Harvard is better than Michigan. So can we talk about football now? That's the thing that has always been kind of funny to me. So, and Michigan actually did what people thought they couldn't do last year, myself included. And I was very excited to see how they were going to build from that point, because it does seem like, that was a very interesting cross-section of their program. So, I've always been viewed as somebody who doesn't like Michigan. And it bothers me because I think that my viewpoint of Michigan is that it has one of the most beautiful campuses in America. It's an insanely good academic institution. I think that their winged helmets and uniforms are one of the best in the sport. They're sponsored by Air Jordan. They play in the most iconic, or one of the most iconic stadiums in the country. They're in a conference now that's going to be dropping off Brinks trucks every other day. From the television money that's coming into it. They've got amongst some of the richest boosters in the entire country. And I think that it's always been a strange dynamic to me, given all these resources and potential, that the program hasn't demanded more. Ryan Day lost to Michigan last year, and the guy's first regular season Big Ten loss in 3 years. And if you go read the story that I wrote about him when I visited Columbus last week for The Athletic, there's people saying hot seat on there. That's the different thought process. The way that people think about it there is different. And I always thought that Michigan could be a top 5 program nationally. I thought Michigan, with the right coach, could be Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State. I mean, why couldn't they? What is different about Ohio State than Michigan, that has Ohio State signing top 5 classes every year, making the playoff most years, winning a national championship in the last decade, and dominating the Big Ten? What's the difference? The difference has to be buy-in and viewpoint of the way that the football program is prioritized. So if you're on the message boards and you're talking, well, we're a better academic institution, that's great. That's not the discussion. The discussion is, what can Michigan do in order to compete on that plane on a consistent basis? And Jim Harbaugh got a long leash. And maybe people will say, well, look, it paid off. But if you're a Michigan fan and you really think about it, A, it took kind of a long time. And B, do you feel like the program is more set up now to do that again any more than they were before last year? Did you think that game is a indication of what's to come, or was that game a blip? So to me, the question should be, what can you do to make that not a blip?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off your point, what we do know is Michigan was able to beat Ohio State once, and 7 tries under Harbaugh, and people are riding that off in the sunset, as they should. They've been waiting, by all means, but now that the clock's starting to reset, it's time to think about what's been far more common than the others. But the other ones happened 6 times compared to 1 in Harbaugh's time here. So I think that's a fair question, because it's not about doing it once, it's about doing it again and what it's going to take to,
or at least being competitive in the games. I personally think that if Michigan could win 3 out of 10 and be competitive in another 3, that would be a very good starting point for expectations. But when you look at the recruiting class that they're putting together this year, and you're looking at the recruiting class that Ohio State's putting together, and you look at the NFL draft picks and all the things, and Michigan's been very good in NFL draft picks, but it doesn't equate. They're not the same place. And my thought process has always been, if I were a Michigan fan or a Michigan administrator, I would demand excellence and expect that. So that last year didn't feel like a parade. It felt like that's what's supposed to happen. Right. And it wasn't that long ago. And I know that college football has changed dramatically since the 90s. It's not even the same sport anymore. But that game, if college football is healthy, you should be going into that game every single year thinking, I have no idea who's going to win. And is it unreasonable to expect that the head coach of Michigan will put them in that position? Because I think I would argue that Jim Harbaugh is nowhere near that right now, even after winning last year.
So let's get to that point. I think this is what we've I know that you've mentioned the mindset and the obsession and the dedication and all. And I think it's hard to argue against it because of the proof is in the pudding, right? You go look at the recruiting classes, go look at the comparisons between the two, go look at the program's trajectories, go look at the past 15, 20 years for both programs. Forget just Harbaugh. It seems like more of a institution issue when it comes to.
And what do you think the difference is, though? Like, I'm an outsider. I don't cover Ohio State anymore, and I don't cover Michigan. You guys are the experts. Like, what do you think the difference is?
Well, where we see everything is that Michigan is never going to budge on that. They're never going to budge on letting student athletes in that wouldn't get into the school if they weren't student athletes outside of NCAA regulation. Now, what we've heard about is that potentially moving that down to where it's easier for players to get enrolled. It's easier for transfers to get enrolled. I mean, Van Jefferson's a Wolverine if it wasn't for it, right? And not to say that like Van Jefferson was like this world beater that would have made Michigan unequivocally better back in 2018, but bringing in Van Jefferson with Shea Patterson was supposed to happen, but didn't because of academics, right? And it wasn't because his grades were bad. It was because his credits simply wouldn't transfer because it's so hard to get credits to transfer at the university. So a huge issue, and the biggest issue is far more the transfer world for Michigan than it is even for the recruiting world. The recruiting world is just kind of like coming down to earth and letting them bring players in who don't have like 1.5s and aren't graduating or anything. But the 2.3s who are like just below Michigan's 2.5 threshold, and they're so specific on that and they just don't budge on it. But the like I said, the most difficult part for Michigan fans to cope with is the transfers, because kids are willingly wanting, or have in the past willingly wanted, to come to the University of Michigan and haven't been able to because of the transfer guidelines. And sometimes, and most times, I would say, I don't think outside of maybe one kid I can remember off the top of my head has it been bad academics. It's just simply the credits won't transfer. They just had a problem with basketball. God, what was that kid? The kid from Texas Tech who was transferring and ended up at Illinois. But he was one of the better players, and they really needed him. And they couldn't get him in, but he was committed, like behind the scenes, like he was going to go to Michigan, but couldn't get in. So it's a troubling problem for them in so many areas, and it's something that, from an institution perspective, like Jim Harbaugh can't enroll kids himself, right? So. And I get that brings me to my next point, because I think there's nothing we can do about that, right? That's something that they're going to have to do themselves. Like, we can't simply analyze the fact that they're not budging on certain things. As much as they continue to convey that things are going to improve in that department, we just haven't seen it quite yet. My question is, let's talk Harbaugh. What can he control, or what has he controlled that over the past year, especially with this 2023 class, that works and hasn't worked? Because look, I mean, you made a great point about the momentum on Ohio State, but another point to look at is look how strongly they closed on signing day back in December. I mean, Darius Clemens, Derek Moore, Marion Walker, like Keon Sabb, those guys are going to be pillars of the program for the next 3 years at least. I mean, two of them are going to start. Derek Moore and Darius Clemens aren't going to start, but they're going to, get rotation. Mason Graham's a guy who just got named a starter from California. So they're recruiting nationally, and they had a really good recruiting class last year. And you'd think the momentum of not only Ohio State, but also the momentum of having a good class and a good close when they were thought to have a bad one last year would roll over into a lot of momentum this year, but it hasn't happened. So why don't you think it's happened, and what have you seen from your world?
I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't. But then sometimes I'm not, because, like, let's just be honest. Jim Harbaugh's an odd dude. Okay. And if I had a ton of money that I could blow and that could pay, I would do anything to sit in a living room with Jim Harbaugh during a coaching visit or an in-home visit. Because I all I've seen from him are his awkward encounters with the media. I don't know if he kind of relaxes a little bit and just becomes a normal person when the doors are shut. But like the thing to me is that you have an odd coach, and I'm saying that's this in a disparaging way. He's just not the normal type of personality that you encounter when, looking at other coaches that are recruiting against him. So right off the bat, he has to appeal to a certain type of personality. And I know that in the past, there have been coordinators and people on the staff that are probably more the front man of who's communicating to these prospects. But you have to appeal to a certain type of person that likes that. And then secondly, too, I feel like Michigan, for the most part, and maybe that's changed in the last year or so, as I've kind of started to focus my attention on other places, hasn't had a clear and identifiable plan that they execute every single year. I feel like they're in different states every year. One year they had a Massachusetts pipeline, and then Don Brown leaves, and then there's like 4 top 100 players in Massachusetts this year, and they're not getting any of them. So I was like, what's the point of that happening? They're not in Ohio anymore, or at least not a major player in Ohio when they used to be a major thorn in Ohio State's side for top 100 players in that state. And I feel like their national recruiting approach, while I think has paid dividends in the past, and they've gotten guys out of different states, I don't know if they have strong footing in the same areas to go into every single. I mean, I think California, they're pretty good. And they've got guys out of California and DC and Georgia and Missouri this year. I think one out of Texas too. But I don't know, like if somebody said, what's Ohio State's plan? And I'm using Ohio State as an example because it's their rival. Focus on Ohio, take the very best players out of Ohio, look for other weak points in Texas, Southern California, and other national recruiting grounds, and attack those players. I couldn't tell you what Michigan's plan is, and I haven't been able to do so for a very amount. And maybe you'll be able to tell me what it is, but it seems to change every year, and it doesn't seem to have the type of direction that you need or the consistency that you need to know what you can rely on in every given year. You need to be able to rely on filling spots. Some years they're better in Detroit than others. Some years they try harder for in-state prospects than they do in other years. And I don't even know, like when you sit down and there's nobody committed in a class and you're looking at your board, what is the plan? And then try to execute that plan. You might not be able to be successful in that plan, but at least have one. Does that make sense? Or do you think are you thinking to yourself, like, this guy's an idiot?
No, I think it makes total sense. And I think you bring up a good point in the fact that Michigan, yes, they don't have Don Brown anymore. So naturally the Massachusetts, obsession of recruiting that state was going to wither away. But you still have a ton of holdover from that staff, from Don Brown's staff, including Harbaugh, who had so much pull in Massachusetts. And then you just mentioned the amount of talent they had this year, and they just don't go there, right? And last year we saw more California kids than usual for Michigan. We didn't see much out of Texas. The only Texas kid they lost at one point, right, was Ethan Burke. So it's inconsistent. And
I mean, if you look at their state breakdown from last year, Texas, South Carolina, Oregon, Michigan, Maryland, Louisiana, Indiana, Idaho, Georgia, Connecticut, Colorado, Alabama, Tennessee, Illinois, Florida, and California. It's like on the surface, that's impressive. They literally hit everything. Right. That's the most national board I think that you could come up with. Where's the emphasis?
And that's where I think we kind of lose the understanding, because I think if you ask them, or if you ask Harbaugh, for instance, he's going to tell you, hey, we look at our board, and every year it's different. Every year we like certain players. Last year we liked the tight end in Georgia. This year we liked the tight end in Idaho. That's what he's going to tell you. And
is that effective?
I'm not. I don't know if it's effective or not, because you don't have any year-to-year. You can't call up a coach and be like, "Hey, who you got?" That's what coaches do. Like, we want to find out who your freshmen are, who's your eighth graders that are coming in, because right now we've got a couple of your juniors.
And while they were in Massachusetts, even though Don Brown left, you got Samson Okunlola pouring syrup on pancakes in East Lansing. What's going on? This is the buildup to that.
And that might be the biggest concern of all, is Mel Tucker, right? Because Mel Tucker is recruiting his ass off. And
I have questions about that too. Will he be able? I think it's going to take time. But he's changing Michigan State's entire approach. And he's trying to take them into a national position where they're bumping heads with Alabama right off the bat, and I think they'll find out this year that it's going to take some time before they win those battles. But, they're getting a ton of talent, and it's just like, why is Samson Okunlola visiting East Lansing and not Ann Arbor, right, after all the time they've spent in Massachusetts?
Not to mention the fact that Michigan's, that's the next question I have for you. And I know we'll wrap up here soon, and this kind of piggybacks off of that a little bit. But talk about how good he is in the O-line play. Michigan, like, it's not hard to sell Michigan right now, right? Like maybe when they were recruiting.
Why would it ever be hard to sell Michigan? That's like my whole thing. Like Michigan, like would be the perfect program to send my kid to.
And on top of that, you win the Joe Moore Award on the offensive line. You're fine. You bring in a guy like JJ McCarthy who has so many connections within recruiting and can help you in the recruiting world, whether people want to believe it or not. Even though as young as he is, he's a guy who can do that.
And on top JJ, of that kid's a very charismatic. He can get you to believe.
Yeah, and Hutchinson just went number 2 overall, and Ojabo would have been too he would have been in the first round as well if it wasn't for the injury. So they've had so much positional success at edge. Like there can't be more than 2 or 3 schools in the country who have had more success at edge over the past 5 years. Like maybe a couple more, but I mean, you're talking Hutch, Pay, Winovich. I mean,
if I would have told you the second that they were walking off the field in Ann Arbor a year ago that they wouldn't have a single top 100 player committed in their class at the beginning of September, what would you have said?
I mean, we all would have laughed, right? It's shocking, and that's why we bring you on, because we understand the NIL thing, and I think we've played out the NIL narrative that they're going to play that out, cross T's, dot I's, all those things. That's fine, be sustainable. But there's too many other schools who are recruiting that top 100 level without NIL being the forefront of each recruitment. Like maybe like the real high end top 1%ers, top 20 guys.
Yeah, and like if you go to Michigan and are awesome, you're still going to get paid.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
With or without the collective. Like you don't think that Will Johnson, if he is a finalist for the Thorpe Award, is going to be in a Little Caesars commercial? It's going to happen. Like I think you're going to get paid. That's especially the thing about NIL. The NIL thing that really kind of makes me upset is that you have so many of these stories because it's new about quarterback gets $8 million guarantee to come to school or whatever. But it's just like, for the most part, if you're an outstanding athlete for a place that cares about football as much as Michigan does, you're going to find a way to get advertisements. I mean, there's Nebraska players, DeColdis Crawford doing a local air conditioning commercial. I mean, like there's opportunities everywhere, and you can market yourself. The internet's a big place. So like, I don't know. And also too, Michigan's got so much money in the booster world. It's just like they're going to figure it out. Like that's not it. And it's just like the academics thing. Okay, you can't get a few transfers in. But like, is that the reason why they haven't been competitive with Ohio State for 2 decades? Because they can't get a few transfers in? The portal just really started to take off.
Right.
And the last 2 years, it's like all I hear all the time, and I'm not saying this about you, I'm just saying in general, whenever I write about Michigan or whatever I tweet anything about Michigan, it's always the excuse, well, this kid was never going to go there because he wanted to leave the state, or you're an asshole because you don't think this or that. And it's like excuse after an excuse after excuse. Like, at what point are you going to be like, are we going to be really good or not? You know what I mean? Like, you got to get to that point. And when you get to that point where you have an administrator, an athletic director, and a fan base that demands winning at the highest level and doesn't allow their coach to go 0-6 or whatever it was against Ohio State to start off his tenure, and is recruiting classes that are solid but not great, when is Michigan going to put their foot down and say, we're going to demand excellence at the very highest level, and if you can't do it, you're out? And then we're on to the next person. And, I know it's tough because Jim Harbaugh is the prodigal son, however you pronounce that word, to come back and save his program. And you don't want to give up on that. The same way that Nebraska's had a really hard time giving up on Scott Frost. Still haven't. And they won last year. So, that's what it is. But, like, if you ask a Michigan fan in an honest moment, do you think that Jim Harbaugh is the coach to lead this program to the promised land of consistent excellence that can beat Ohio State 5 out of 10 years and make the playoff 4 out of 10 years or 3 out of 10 years? I bet you 95% of them would be honest to themselves and say no. So if that's the case, then when is Michigan going to hold their coach to a higher standard? Especially one that almost got fired 2 years ago, restructured his contract, which, by the way, I respect the hell out of that. To do what he did and to stay committed and take half the money and then go win a game like that, perfect. All the respect in the world. But do you think he's the right person for the job long-term? Especially the guy who's trying to bail out of there after they won last year, the first chance he got?
Those are the narratives. What's
the narrative? It's a fact.
Well, it's a fact, but it's also a narrative, and that he never signed for that job, and what happened in between him flying there and flying back, and how much of that was damn near a signee, or he went there and knew kind of right away he wasn't going to do it. All we know is that he was completely honest with the players and completely honest with the team, and he wasn't backdooring anyone. And he was cut and clear. I signed a 7-year deal to Michigan. I said when I signed my deal at the 7th year, I was going to possibly think about returning to the NFL. So I possibly thought about it, and then I decided I didn't want to do it. Now, did he never get offered the job? If he did, would he have taken it? Of course. Those are where the narratives come in, because we don't know exactly what happened.
Brandon, I'm not even saying the guy's a bad dude for wanting to go to the NFL. Like, I hope people don't take that. Like, dude, I would go listen.
How could you not?
I was talking about how I'd listen to any job offer I could get right now. Like, go get paid and pursue your happiness. I have no problem with that. My problem is that the bulk of the results that Michigan has had in his tenure have been less than the expectations. And if you ask yourself in an honest moment, if you're a listener, before you tweet at me that I'm an asshole, is Jim Harbaugh the person I would want to sign for the next 10 years at Michigan? If the answer to that question is yes for you, then by all means, you're probably going to get it. But if it's not, what needs to change in order to get a coach who gets it the way that you need to get it in order to win a national title? Because what was that? The best season of Michigan's had in 20 years last year?
Yeah, and
maybe longer.
I mean, that's the other thing. Is we talked about how long ago 97 was, right? When was the last time Michigan was a football factory, quote unquote? Like 2006. That was it's probably Lloyd Carr's last year. And even then, even in Lloyd Carr's final years, they were the exact same team they've been over the past few years, where they're just really good, but not great. They're 9-3, they're 10-2. They're 9-3, they're 10-2. They're 11-1 out of nowhere. Or they had not out of nowhere, but they had a year where they go 11-1. And then they're back to 9-3, 10-2. So now it's the question around Michigan is Jim Harbaugh Lloyd Carr, or is Jim Harbaugh Jim Harbaugh? Because Lloyd Carr had one really, really good team, and the rest of his teams were good, but never jumped that high.
I'm going to hit you with
Ohio State, but
some truth bombs here too.
Yeah.
You play Madden or anything? You play games online?
Of course I play Madden.
So if you took Michigan's season last year and you started a simulation after the Ohio State win, and you simulated the playoffs 1,000 times, how many times do you think Michigan would win it?
I think probably maybe one. And even
out of 1,000?
Out of 1,000. I mean, I don't know. I'm not
going to. Well, one's generous because my answer is 0.
Before that game, first and foremost, Georgia wasn't favored by enough ever, first and foremost. Second, on top of that, how many teams are going to beat that? I'm on the side of like that Georgia team was absolutely ridiculous outside of the football factories. I think like Ohio State goes and plays Georgia better that night than Michigan does, 110%.
Maybe not. Ohio State's lines were terrible last year.
Right.
But the point that I'm making here with that is that the best season that Michigan has had in 25 years amounted to a team that couldn't compete on that level in a million years. Right. And that, to me, is the other thing, too. It's like you got to the mountaintop, right? Is that the mountaintop for Michigan? Is beating Ohio State and winning the Big Ten the grand prize? Or do Michigan fans expect to win a national title? Because even though they accomplished the first 80% of what it takes to win a national championship last year, they were nowhere near built to win it all. To beat Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama in back-to-back games, you could do that a million times. I don't think it would happen once if we were using the correct data. So that's the other thing, too, of just like, is what happened last year the most successful season possible? And if the answer is yes, then you got your guy who can do it because he's done it. But if you want more, then, you referred to last year's class as super successful. It was a very good class. Their top just 3 players in the country.
The final day.
Yeah, the close was really good, right? And, I mean, they got Will Johnson, too.
They were bad. I mean, that was a really, worrisome class leading up to that point. I mean, almost as much as this one.
But number 12, the difference between number 12 and number 3 might as well be the Grand Canyon.
Right.
So,
exactly.
You
look at S&P Plus projections. I don't know if you ever looked at those, but if you look at the S&P Plus right now, the 3 teams on top, Ohio State or Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia, those 3 are rated like at least 9 points higher than Oklahoma at 4. And Oklahoma's only like a half spot, maybe 1 point higher than Michigan at 6.
I think you can make the case that the gap between 1 and 5 is bigger than the gap between 5 and 30.
I 100% agree, honestly.
So if you want to break into that top 5,
right,
then the number 12 class in the country ain't going to cut it.
So
neither is the number 28 class.
The one thing that I take away from what you said was when you brought up, will Michigan do this? Will they do this again, or was that it? Was that the mountaintop? What we do know about that really the only thing we do know about it is that, and it has nothing to do with recruiting, is the building and the team, and this team in particular. I mean, and these players. I can't speak for what's going to happen in 24 and 25, but the players who are at Michigan right now, that's the front of their mind is we didn't do anything we wanted to do. There's pretty much zero complacency within that program from top to bottom as far as last year goes. That's not recruiting though. How they recruit and the effort they put into recruiting, and Matt Weiss has to become a better recruiter because of what they've done with the quarterbacks, and they just have to become a better recruiting operation overall, right? That has nothing to do with what we're talking about as far as complacency goes with Ohio State, as far as play with this team. But you have to apply that thinking. They're applying it extremely well to present day. They're applying it extremely well to camp. I mean, they had the Ohio State drill last year to address all the Ohio State problems, but this year, I don't know if there is an Ohio State drill, but it hasn't even been brought up, and Ohio State hasn't been brought up. It's only been the national championship that this team's talked about. Whether they get there or not, it's a whole nother thing. But either way, that's their language. It's national championship. They said they still want to beat their rivals, but their focus is the national championship because they know they're good enough to get there, and they're disappointed that they didn't do what they needed to do when they did last year. So as far as this team goes, yes, but this team and the quarterbacks and the players, they can't go recruit. That's Harbaugh, that's Matt Weiss, that's Sharon Moore, that's Grant Newsome. I mean, those are the guys who have to go do that, and not discrediting their efforts or anything, not discrediting any of that. I think that this program has a clear their identity in recruiting is very much so. We want guys who fit our identity and fit our mold, can come in here and be competitors, and the whole thing with Harbaugh, football factory type of thinking, where it's craving contact, et cetera, et cetera. So they're looking for fits more than they're looking for anything else. They're looking for fits. Personality-wise, character-wise. Second, they're thinking about what they can do when they develop, because they're developing. They're a development-first type of place. They're not going to get guys that are going to start right away. They're going to get guys that they think they can develop past that top 5 mark, is from what we can see from the recruiting class. And why is that? Do you think that's because, or I should not asking you, I guess I'm asking the listeners, do we think that's because Michigan strikes out on all the guys who can be the early impact, that they have to settle for the guys, and then they are really good developers, so it just helps them? Or is it because that's just how they want to recruit? They don't want to do the hokey pokey with a bunch of 5 stars. They want to go get the low end 4 stars who are kind of overlooked, or they want to go get the high end 4 stars as their mainstays and their centerpieces, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all questions and things that we don't necessarily have answers
to. It's making my head
explode.
Yeah,
you just draw conclusions from.
Well, you're making my head explode.
Well, that's what I always do when I send you fantasy trades.
I don't understand. Do people think that the programs that get 5 stars aren't good developmentally?
Dude, I'm not sitting here telling you that.
No, okay.
I'm telling.
Yeah, I was going to say, do people think Nick Saban doesn't develop his talent?
But no, I'm telling you that Michigan has proven with guys like Kwity Paye and guys like David Ojabo and all the offensive linemen like Andrew Stuber that they can develop. So you start to think about, if they were to bring in the football factory mindset with recruiting that Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson has, how much more can they take that development, right?
Lot.
Because
I take a 5-star prospect who's a freak, who can do things physically that only God has given him, and then you start the development from that bar, then the result is higher.
Totally different. And so
Georgia's Jordan Davis was a 3-star prospect. They developed the shit out of him, didn't they? And guess what? They had 9 other 5-star defensive backs out there, half of which were on the bench. So it's this idea of, well, we're not going to mess around with 5-star prospects. We're going to go get the overrated or the underrated 4 stars. Okay, dude, do that. And then one day, when you beat Ohio State and get to where you want to go developing the players that you developed, you're going to go to the end of the tunnel. And the light at the end of that tunnel is going to be a train, and the train's going to be Georgia. And that's what's going to happen. So that, to me, that's the whole thing.
That's true.
There's no winning the national championship by developing well, because everybody develops well. Ohio State develops well. They've got a hallway that's 100 yards long of all the NFL players they have. Alabama develops well. Georgia develops well. And you're not going to out-develop anybody. And that's why this Auburn situation is happening right now, because they hired a coach that thought they were going to out-develop Alabama, and all that's turned out as a dumpster fire. So, and I'm not saying this towards you. I'm just saying
No, not at all.
As you are looking at Michigan, you should be hoping that they sign, and Michigan should be striving to sign 8 to 10 top 100 players nationally in a given year, and then start the development at a higher bar. And they have developed. They've had a lot of draft picks, and their defensive line, like you said, has been awesome. Now, if they start developing Shamar Turner and the 5-star prospects that come in from that point, imagine what they'd have in year 3 of those guys. So, that's
Paris
that's
Johnsons of the world, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like they've gotten 5-star prospects before. It's not like they don't do it. But it's just like, to me, if you have 30 or 40 top 100 players on your roster at any given time after 4 years of recruiting at that level, even if half of them miss, which is a huge miss rate, you still have 15 top 100 players in your starting lineup out of 22.
Right.
Like that's the power of it. It's not like every individual player who gets recruited. Of course, there's error in that. It might work out, it might not. But at a cumulative level, when you do it on a grand scale, year over year, you don't even have to be that good at developing to have an awesome starting lineup and depth. So, and to me, like, I think that Michigan is a good enough place from top to bottom. Fans, the people who are listening to the show, the stadium, the facilities, the uniform, the academics, the NIL potential, the money, all of that, to be a team that recruits top 5 classes year after year after year. And all the other talk about whether or not they do it or whether or not they can do it another way, I don't have time to hear that, and like, and if you're a fan and last year was good enough for you, then I got good news for you. They'll be able to do that again at some point in the future, because no team loses 100 games in a row to the other team. But if you expect more, then I still think there's more juice to squeeze out of that fruit.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the trajectory of Michigan recruiting and you look at 2016, 2017, when you're talking to Sean Gary, David Long, Don Peoples-Jones, just guys like that, where they brought in and didn't have success. I mean, some of their worst years were with those guys on your team. You wonder if that left a sour taste in the mouth of Harbaugh, and that's what kind of caused this shift in how he recruited. As bad as it looks from the outside, internally to them, it looks exactly how they want it to. But I think the quarterback recruiting you saw with Dante Moore, and I still don't, they weren't recruiting CJ Carr well enough to take him anyway, but with the Dante Moore missing, whether that's NIL or not, you can sit here and speculate. I still think it's Michigan had an opportunity to close that if they wanted to. There's things they have to improve, and I think there's things they're looking in the mirror at internally, but I think overall they still don't see anything that we're talking about right now, unfortunately. And so maybe they will. Maybe they do turn up to that top 3 standpoint in recruiting year to year, or get closer to it than they are now, and start to turn this thing.
That's an interesting story idea that you just had, Brandon, and maybe I might look into this. But as you were talking, I looked up Michigan's offers for this year, or at least reported offers, and they've only offered 15 top 100 players in this cycle. And I don't know if that's just incomplete database or if that's actually what they did. But if they only offered 15 top 100 players, I'd be very curious to know how much that compares to the regular program. It might be way less, because that is like, if you would have asked me how many top 100 players did Michigan offer, I would have think far more. 80. Yeah, because they're all very good. And I'll just go to another random team and look this up later, but that might be an interesting story idea, because it's just like, not that I would ever be able to get an answer if I, asked about it in a press conference there, but it is an interesting dynamic. Well, I tried to ask Jim Harbaugh a recruiting question in 2016 once.
Oh, I remember that one, actually.
You do?
Yeah. I don't remember verbatim.
I don't even remember what the question was. I just remember the response.
Yeah, same.
And it was like a very benign question of just like, hey, how important, just for examples, like New Jersey to your guys' recruiting footprint. Like, there was no implication, it was just a regular question. He goes, I don't know what you mean by that. And I rephrased it. How important is New Jersey and the talent within the state important to your recruiting strategy? He goes, I don't know what you mean by that. That was it. And I've never asked him another question again, because it's just like a waste of time. But it would be interesting if you got somebody on the staff there that is knowledgeable about, what they're doing internally, if that is low for what you would expect. Because, like, I don't know if you knew that or not, but you probably would have guessed higher, right?
Yeah, and I think the one absolutely would have guessed higher, and the one conclusion you can draw from that is even if those offers aren't reported, usually offers are put into a system no matter what the recruiting database is. Usually offers are put into the system when players are first starting to get popular, right? Like they're first getting offered. So if anything, even if Michigan offered more, they were way behind in offering them, right? Because all of the ones that are typically listed right away are the early offers. And if ones get left behind, it's because that kid's just committed and that offer doesn't matter, or he just never reported it. And if he never reported it, is he really interested in it, right? So those are, I would think that 15 would probably be the number because those are probably the 15 that mattered. Or even if they offered 40, only 15 of them mattered. So you can talk all day about the Michigan recruiting strategy, what they believe in, what they don't believe in, what they should change, what they shouldn't change. We'll end with this. If Michigan is successful this year, right? I mean, we talked about it a moment ago. Michigan still very much so has a good team this year. They certainly have a belief and a mentality similar to what you brought up in that they don't want last year to just be the only year. Roman Wilson, a junior wide receiver, said the other day that they want us to be the revolution behind Michigan football and flipping the script and all of that. So this team certainly has that. So if this team goes out there, performs well, let's say it, what they go beat Ohio State, first team to do it back-to-back years since I think 96 or 97 or so, something around those years. I might be wrong on that. But either way, let's say Michigan goes and does that. They're 11-1, win the Big Ten again, have a similar year to last year, and then have a strong close to a signing day similar to last year. Let's say like number 8 to 12. At that point, if Michigan does that in back-to-back years, brings in classes similar to the ones in back-to-back years, which guys like Sab and Graham get involved this year, Will Johnson get involved this year, does that change your mind? Do you think like, okay, maybe this team is just recruiting totally differently than the blueprint and it's totally insane, but for some crazy reason it's working because they won again?
So you mean like beat Ohio State and Columbus again and then win the Big Ten again?
Right. Let's say this team has that type of season again,
Oh,
which I know is a hypothetical, but
yeah, no, if they do it again, I still don't know that it would change my mind on recruiting rankings. And let me come clean on something. Michigan offered far more than 15 top 100
that's what I
players.
figured.
Yeah. I just looked it up and the page didn't load properly because I was stunned when I saw that. They actually offered all of them. So that also throws a wrench in the other theory, which is they're not trying to get them. They certainly are, and it's not working out. But my take on that is this stat that which I might tattoo on my back someday. Since 2000, which is the modern era of recruiting rankings, started by your friends at Rivals, right? They're the first recruiting rankings.
Yes.
That weren't in magazine form anyway. There have been 3 teams that have won a national championship without signing a top 5 class in any of the previous 4 years. Do you know the teams?
Clemson?
Trivia.
Maybe? Okay. Clemson, would that be one?
That's one.
Okay. It's got to be early 2000s teams. Shoot.
Don't mean to put you on the spot. It's a hard trivia question.
Clemson, I knew. But
Clemson was 2 of the 3.
Okay, so 2 Clemson teams.
2 Clemson teams, which is the Deshaun Watson team and the Trevor Lawrence team. And the last outlier,
which is crazy that Trevor Lawrence's team somehow makes that category, even though they have like the most insane classes.
Because they still sign top 10 classes every year, but they didn't. Right. There's only 3 teams that has won a national championship in the last 22 years without a top 5 class in any of the previous 4 years. And the last one is Auburn with Cam Newton.
Oh yeah,
and that team wouldn't have won a playoff game probably, or who knows? Like they wouldn't have won 2. And what I'll say is that Dabo Swinney must be a genius because he did it during a time in which they had stark advantages at quarterback and were very good at evaluating. So, like, will somebody say, is it impossible to win a national championship without having high recruiting rankings? It's not impossible, but the 3 teams that did it in the last 22 plus years were teams that had outstanding, maybe once in a lifetime quarterbacks playing. Also signed top 10 classes during those periods anyway, and had a lot of talent. Now, the thing that's difficult about that applying the last 22 years to now is the talent is so concentrated at the top now. I think 100 of of the top 100 players, I think 67 of them last year went to 5 schools. So like you're like looking at like the A&Ms, the Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State, and I think Clemson was the last one last year. They have so much talent on their teams that like even if you develop a top 10 class 4 years in a row very good, you eventually run into the dream team.
Right.
So like when you say if Michigan does it again, will that change your opinion of them? It'll certainly change my opinion about Harbaugh and the program for sure. Last year changed my opinion about him. Last year I thought he shouldn't have a job, and now I think there's a discussion to be had because he did something that I don't think a lot of people can do, given the resources that he had with the roster last year. But I don't think that it would ever change my mind about whether or not they would be equipped to win a national championship, because I do think that if Michigan does what it did last year, they will face Alabama eventually, and they will lose by a lot. And that's just the way it is. And it's not an insult. The last time Ohio State played Alabama, and they're built that way, they lost by a lot. So I think that you have to definitively recruit at a top 6 to 5 level on an annual basis for 4 years in a row to win a national championship in college football these days. And that might change if half of everyone's roster is changing in the transfer portal. Zach Evans and guys like that are just going to get picked up after their first year. The recruiting rankings might be less accurate, but I do think that the composite rankings that tell you how many 5-star prospects are on a given roster will always be telling.
Yeah.
And Michigan's going to have to do that. So, is Jim Harbaugh the person? The administration there has made it seem, or at least with the way that they've structured a new deal and the fact that he's there, believes that is the guy who's going to get that done. But I would, it's not even a Michigan thing. I don't think there's a single team in college football that hasn't recruited those mega classes the last 3 or 4 years that's equipped to win a national championship.
Well, the only point we'll make before closing is that Michigan does have 5-star quarterback who's in a quarterback competition, and they do have a similar makeup if he's in to those teams that won. And not saying that J.J. McCarthy is unequivocally the guy who needs to start.
They've got a great offensive line. Donovan Edwards is awesome, right? He's going to be the dude this year. One of the dudes.
Corum and Edwards I think evenly split. They're both pretty great.
Eric All's one of the better tight ends in the country.
Yeah, and his backup's not much worse. I mean, his backup's probably just as good. Luke Schoonmaker in different ways, of course, but I mean, they'll both be NFL guys. They have the more skill, more depth at the skill positions this year than they've had.
I drafted Eric All on my fantasy team.
As you should. Darius Clemens. I mean, Darius Clemens he's on my Devy team as well. I think he's going to be one of the best wideouts to ever play at Michigan when he's all said and done. I mean, he's just an anomaly physically, I think. So they have pieces, and they have the makeup of this roster similar to the ones that you mentioned who have won. However, you can't point towards history as a tell of what's going to happen this year, right? Because it's only, you said, 4 out of 22? So while
3 out of 22.
3 out of 22.
And 2 of which are the same program.
Yeah, so the only comparison I wanted to draw was that Michigan does have that top flight.
Well, the thing that recruiting at that level brings you, Brandon, and you know this, but I just want to reiterate it for the listeners, is that when the best player on your defense blows his knee out, or your quarterback misses 3 games, or your left tackle is out for the year, the depth of the defensive line that comes in the fourth quarter in games, there's a lot of teams that have a lot of really awesome pieces starting for them. It's the teams that are fresh in the third quarter of a 1-score game because they have 5-star defensive linemen that haven't played yet coming off the bench in the third quarter and kicking ass. Yeah. It's the depth, the ability to sustain injuries. Like Ohio State won their national championship with their third string quarterback. It's like this it's like that too. It's just like Michigan certainly has its pieces, but over the course of a long, grueling year, going undefeated for anybody's hard. But getting out alive without any major injuries or suspensions or like all the things that occur in a college, campus or on a college program, like having the depth of talent is also paramount. So, But I'm with you. I think they're going to be awesome. I think they'll be just as good, or hopefully just as good as they were a year ago. And even if they go to Columbus and beat Ohio State again, I just don't think that you could sit here with a straight face and say they're going to beat this Alabama team.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So,
I mean, nobody could. And I think that's where Michigan is kind of running into trouble, I think, with recruiting the 23 and 24 classes, because they have so much depth right now, but how much of that depth is a token of the COVID year and having so many sixth-year guys? I mean, Mike Morris, Taylor Upshaw, those are two starters that are fifth and sixth-year guys for them on the defensive end. And then you have a Noma coming in. On top, they have so much depth, but they're losing so much of it next year throughout. And, they have some depth in other spots, especially skill. But once these eligibilities run out, once the COVID years are out, what are they going to do? Is this a filler class for them? Is this just we need to fit some pieces in some places where we're low because we're so stacked at other positions? Do they go hard? Because they've insisted they're going to go extremely hard in 2024. I mean, it starts and ends with Jaden Davis. If they can get him, build out the rest of that class, they can start to recoup what they missed this year, is what we're being led to believe right now. All those things haven't happened yet. We'll see. We've gone way longer than I promised you we'd go, so we appreciate you coming on. I think, Ari, you're probably one of the more dependable, honest, and transparent voices in recruiting. And
hey, thanks, man. Do you think they'll hate me for this?
Huh?
Do you think I was irrational? You think the people will keep hating me?
No, I think we humanized you a bit today. I think we.
I hope so. I hope so, because I don't like when people hate me. It hurts my feelings.
We appreciate you coming on. You guys can follow Ari on Twitter. It's just your name, right? At Ari Wasserman.
Yep, that's right, man.
Very unique one. So that is it for us today. And Who's Got Next? We will be talking to Zach Libby, our recruiting editor, on the other side of this extremely long edition of Who's Got Next. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and we will talk to you soon.